Hey everyone, this is Mike Kendall.
And I'm Kavita Aprachu. We are the co-hosts of Shift podcast brought to you by Moves the Needle.
At Shift, we hope to inspire you to make a difference as we learn from top innovation leaders about how they are driving impact around the world. On today's show, we're happy to have Stephen Ranjan, Vice President of New Product Development at Roche Diabetes Care. He will be sharing how Roche is continuing to innovate during the global pandemic, plus insights into building a strong innovation program.
Before we jump in, I'd like to tell you about an offer we have for our listeners. For the next week, you can sign up for a 30-minute free coaching session to learn to gain deep customer empathy and identify your customers' underserved needs by using our Customer Problem Zoom tool. Companies like Humana, Cisco, and Nike have used this simple yet powerful tool to create solutions and drive value for their customers. To take advantage of this offer, visit the link at the bottom of the screen and you're in. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, Stephen Ranjan. Stephen is Vice President of New Product Development at Roche Diabetes Care, where he is responsible for developing strategies to drive innovation in hardware and digital and create solutions for healthcare professionals, people at risk of developing diabetes, as well as those diagnosed with diabetes. He has over 15 years of leadership experience in healthcare, including pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and health IT. Stephen has extensive experience in driving open innovations and establishing new collaborations between customers as well as technology players such as Amazon, Verily, and other digital health startups. Before joining Roche Diabetes Care, Stephen worked at Merck, Johnson & Johnson, and Epic Systems. Stephen has a bachelor's in computer science from West Virginia Wesleyan College and earned his MBA from University of Wisconsin, where he currently serves on the Executive Advisory Board of the University of Wisconsin School of Business's Erdman Center. Stephen has a passion for applying design thinking and patient-centric innovation to create world-class experiences. When he's not solving problems in healthcare, his interests include racquetball and photography. Welcome, Stephen, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kavita and Mike, for having me. It's a pleasure to join you on this podcast.
Absolutely. We are so glad you were able to join us. It's been a while since we talked, and a lot has happened since then. So how are you and your family holding up during this time of massive change in this world?
Yeah, Kavita, I think everybody has experienced some form of change or the other, whether it's personal life, whether it's your work environment, and definitely personally, the change has been quite dramatic. For me, no travel. On one hand, that's a positive sign. I'm able to spend more time with the kids and my wife. But in terms of balancing, work and school for the kids, that's been a lot harder than we expected, especially when you were at the start of the shutdown or work, stay-at-home orders. People thought, okay, it's maybe a few weeks and then we'll be back to normal, and you kind of had a little bit more of an outlook. And then 2 months rolled by, and then you're now changing your perspective, saying, okay, how do I do this for the rest of the year? And so that's been the transition for us, is trying to just figure out how you manage dual careers as well as keep your kids engaged and balance time. But for us, fortunately, our jobs have allowed us to be flexible. So we're thankful for that. And so I've shifted my schedule to match closer to the European time zones. So it allows me to front load my day, and then my wife tends to take care of the kids in the morning while I do kind of the afternoon shift. So it works for the most part, but jobs, especially when you are in a global organization, the work continues on. So the key challenge for us now is really trying to strike a balance, how not to make sure that we're working 12 hours instead of really breaking up time for work, and then also breaking up time for home and family. So it's a different set of creating boundaries, I would say.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things it's very easy to do when you're working from home is continue to work, because there is no separation between home and work. But I'm sure it must feel very strange not to be in an aircraft for this length of time.
Yeah, I should say I am appreciating the time I get to spend with my kids. They're young ones, so the blessing in disguise is that I get to spend more time with them. So I'm thankful for that.
I'm sure they appreciate it too.
Yep.
Yeah, we've talked to a number of guests and kind of wondering how do we take some of the best of this situation forward as we get back to what maybe used to be normal, but not try to have one or the other, but how can we merge those two together? So I was wondering if maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the innovation work and the product innovation work that you and your team have been up to, and how, if any, impact you've seen from the coronavirus epidemic, how that's impacted that work.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the way we've approached product innovation and a lot of some of the tools moves the needle also provide, but it's really focusing on the customer and the problem that they're focused on, truly understanding that, being able to kind of feel that pain, if you will, and the key piece for us as an organization is figuring out how you get out of the building. And really understand or empathize and feel that pain. And working in a regulated industry that's very different than maybe a startup that doesn't have the regulation or is a bit more open to experiment could potentially do. And so because we were learning that, and that started kind of the second half of 2018. And so I would say most of the teams kind of figured out how to operate in what I would say would be a distributed or a global team, because we're based in 3 locations, Spain, Germany, and the US. And, by introducing some of these newer techniques, we forced the teams also to think about how do you actually capitalize on the fact that you are in a distributed setup. And so I would say, so the teams that probably had started on that journey definitely fared much better when we really shifted to kind of a stay-at-home order or work-from-home situation, because they had some of the tools in place to really prioritize their work. They were already familiar with having virtual calls and stand-ups, whereas for some of the others, I think we had to introduce some of these techniques. And the other piece that I think the pandemic kind of forced us to do is, in a global team, you tend to have maybe more site-specific meetings or get-togethers. And because we were all kind of pushed to work from our home, it allowed us to maybe create some more cross-site meetings or calls that allowed us to kind of bring a bit of a sense of community, and that's probably the biggest change is how do you maintain that sense of community amongst your team, not only in your small team but also in the broader team that you're part of, and the good thing is we had the tools to do that, so we were able to adopt it. I think the watch out, I would say, is you don't overdo it. We talked a little bit about my own personal, experience on creating the right boundaries between work and other activities, and that's probably, I think, the key piece is we really look at this as being more of a long-term, blended model, as I like to say. We have to be mindful of the boundaries, because the boundaries help you also keep your mind fresh with different ideas. You don't get caught in a rut. So especially if you're in the innovation space, you don't want to kind of fall back to things that you want different perspectives to stir your thinking and trigger different ideas. And so, encouraging people to have that boundary, do other activities, is even more critical at this time.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Especially, I think, like you said, you had some of that set up being a global organization, but even so, it sounds like crossing across some of those boundaries that maybe hadn't been crossed before.
Exactly.
So that's interesting. Do you have maybe one or two examples that really made you proud when you saw the challenge presented for your team, and maybe saw an individual or a team really rise to that occasion that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that to me, what I'm most proud of is the fact that the teams actually didn't get phased by all of these changes and the disruption, if you will, that created. They stuck to their schedule, and we had one team that started with a blank sheet of paper, and after about 18 months, presented to our internal review board and received funding for pursuing the development of the idea. And so, to me, I think that shows perseverance and some resilience on the team to push forward despite all of this, what seemed like a sudden impact, and they stuck to their timeline. So that that for me, and this is that's one example, but this is true of the other teams, is they've been able to maintain their schedule. There are definitely challenges that we face, especially when it comes to getting access to customers. Given that we're in the healthcare field, we have to give space to healthcare professionals to help out and address the need of the pandemic. And so so we're trying to figure out how to balance. There are things that we can do internally while we wait for maybe the capacity to open up, or we're starting to experiment more virtual interactions when typically we might have done those as face to face or in person. So there's a bit of, I would say, shifting of priorities so we can keep work still progressing. But I'm pleased to say that teams have not necessarily come to a complete stop. We're able to keep things moving forward.
Yeah, it's interesting when your customers are impacted so much as they are in this situation. Did you find that there were healthcare providers that were very open to talking to your teams and still engaged, or was it kind of just running into a wall, and you guys had to find a way to just sort of cope with that during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on, I mean, again, if you look at healthcare, there's so many different stakeholders we might interact with. I would say the folks that are more in the front line, I think that's where the availability, is something that we've had to put off and, wait for the situation to stabilize, and that's understandable. But there are other stakeholders within the healthcare system that we may want to get insights on, or understand better about the needs of an offering that we've been able to connect with, and we've switched to more virtual ways of doing that. I would say, surprisingly, we've encountered people looking at this opportunity as a way to say, how do I reimagine the future with digital? And so we've actually found a lot more conversations where what we're working on and what the customer is looking for really fitting better because the pandemic has forced them to think about a future where digital is a key enabler.
Yeah, maybe some of the laggards that all of a sudden are early adopters right away. They start to see the future and jump into it.
Yeah, or those that probably have been fairly progressive in their adoption of tools, but are kind of taking a more forward-looking view and saying, rather than just addressing the issues with today, saying, how could I start preparing for tomorrow when I will need some kind of a blend between the in-person and the virtual, and so I would say those that have experience adopting digital are probably in a better position, but that's more of an anecdotal point. I don't think I would say that's I've not done the market research to validate it, but that's more anecdotal at the moment.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier that working with Moves the Needle, and we've had the privilege to work with some of your teams. Could you maybe reflect a little bit on that journey as we helped build those innovation capabilities personally for you and for the teams? What were some of the highlights of that journey for you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when I reflect back, it's almost a 2-year, 18 to 24-month journey now. There were learnings in multiple fronts that we had to kind of tackle, especially when you're introducing a new methodology and doing a transformation in the organization. On one front, we were really learning much more about a new customer, a customer that we probably didn't spend as much time in the past. And I think, a lot of the tools around digging deeper into the customer and their problem really helped us go deep into those problems and figure out what's the most important pain point to pursue. From a leadership perspective, what I had to do and what I had to balance was, one, learning an organization in terms of how it responded to new models and new methodologies, but also bring in some new ways, because I had just come into the organization and was leveraging this approach of that Moves the Needle was supporting us with, and so that required a lot more emphasis on listening to the teams and understanding their challenges, because if I needed to understand where the barriers were in the organization, I needed to, just like we talk about in the lean approach, you need to kind of get out to your customers. And in this case, for me, the teams were my, if you will, customers. So I needed to be listening. And so I invested a lot of time really immersing myself and understanding what the teams were going through. And it also helped me then coach them better. That was a way for me to, coach them and augment the support that was being provided by our strategic insights and open innovation team. And then the third dimension is really kind of looking at it from how do you transfer a concept on a piece of paper into something that you actually build and prioritize into your into your development program. And that has gone through 2 transition points in the time period. And for me, those transition points are usually also stress points or fracture points in an organization, because you were able to maybe get a team in an isolated manner to really understand and apply the new ways of thinking. But success doesn't come if they've just completed their work. Success comes when they hand it to the next phase. And so I think in this scenario, for me personally, paying attention to those and understanding kind of, within the organization, who the key stakeholders are, and bringing them along and helping them understand the approach, helping them be part of the journey, were critical things that I had to kind of anticipate. And so so one, not overburdening the team with, aspects that are relevant later on in a development life cycle, but really protecting them, but also knowing who's the next critical stakeholder and then giving them a view into what was going on so they could help us understand how you transfer the idea to the next stage. And so those are kind of the three areas that for me, I think, I had to pay attention to. There was definitely a lot of personal learning in terms of how the organization worked, how does my approach fit in, and it had to do quite a bit on the adaptability of my leadership style within the organization, and I had to make sure that I didn't come in with a very rigid way and then go to a screeching halt, but really adapt and figure out and give time to the team to say, if it takes longer, that's okay. It's more important to make sure that the approach fits in and transfers from early stage to now product development.
Stephen, clearly you did a fantastic job of incorporating the lean innovation approach with your stage gate process, right? Now, healthcare every vertical has their challenges, and healthcare has its own unique challenges. So for a leader that's looking to follow this lean process, because we know, there's a saying that's going that it's survival of the fastest right now, not so much survival of the fittest. So given the uniqueness of the healthcare vertical, what would your suggestions be to other leaders who are trying to do the same in terms of how to balance the regulatory risk, compliance risk, and also just quickly developing solutions that you can test, given the nature of this field?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and this is what I always come back to, is focus on the problem, not that you want to solve, not the solution, and find, that you want to find a problem that it solves. And I think I would say, for me, that's fundamentally the most important thing that anybody in healthcare should make sure that they are laser focused on. In the more traditional areas, you tend to know how to do that. But if you're trying to go into an adjacent area or a completely disruptive area, it becomes even more important. Because if you do not know the problem you're solving and for whom you're solving that problem, then the assumptions that you're building your product on are always going to be weak. And so this is where I think, in our situation, what we needed to first do is make sure that we truly understood what was the problem from a patient's point of view. But we had to give the team enough space to then say, how does that problem then reflect on the healthcare professional? What does it mean for the healthcare profession? You may have solved the problem or understood the problem for the patient, but do you understand it in the context of the healthcare professional? Who is the healthcare professional? Are you talking about a coach? Are you talking about a specialist? Are you talking about a general practitioner? And then ultimately you have to figure out, once you know these two key, you call them users in the system, who is going to pay for it? Are you going after the consumer and targeting consumerism in healthcare? Or are you going down the traditional route of reimbursement pathways? I mean, really kind of getting the team to de-risk those and figure out which path they were going down are critical pieces. But ultimately, I think it was important for me to make sure that the teams made a choice. Pick the path you're going to go down, because that then determined how much runway we needed to give the team. Because if they were going down a more reimbursable pathway, then we need to kind of give them runway to make sure that there's evidence generation factored in. There's budgets that we identify. We determine whether the budget exists, or you need to create the budget for it. So there's a very different approach in terms of supporting that project. If you're going after something that's more consumer-like, then you need to make sure your organization has capabilities to put things out directly to consumers if you want to get it out into the hands of consumers. So you need to understand a bit of where your organization is. But I would say the biggest tool that was probably helpful for the team was recognizing that you could do a lot with clickable prototypes, with websites. Everything needed to be within the constraints of the regulation that we're in. And so that meant you cannot just put a website out there and expect to get feedback. You needed to do it in a more controlled manner. And as a leader, I needed to understand that evidence was useful, but it would not necessarily give me all of the information I needed around behaviors. Because one of the things that Lean pushes you to do is to really capture evidence on the behaviors. And so you need to understand that the technique you use may not necessarily give you the right data, but it's still going to give you a strong enough signal to continue investing more. And that was what was most important for me, is that the teams were really paying attention to that signal to say, yes, we need to keep going. There is something here. And then what we needed to support as leaders is make sure that they could do it compliantly given that we're in a regulated industry.
Stephen, you brought up a really strong point, I think, that sometimes gets missed when you talk to some organizations and they say they want to do design thinking or they want to do innovation. They go out and they teach their teams and they train a bunch of people, maybe even go into empathy, evidence, and experiments like we teach. But if those teams don't have a governing structure or support to get funded, to get that evidence heard by the right stakeholders within an organization, those ideas either die or the teams give up because they keep really fighting a battle that is really hard to win. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what the mindset shift or the structure shift was for you guys to go from maybe more of a waterfall traditional funding stage gate approach to more of a almost Shark Tank growth board type of approach that still fit within the corporate structure to get evidence for funding?
For a team that's almost like an internal entrepreneur or kind of a entrepreneur within a large corporation, what you have to recognize is you actually are, and you use the term battle, Mike, so this triggered something in my mind, is you're actually fighting two battles simultaneously. On one hand is you're trying to figure out, you fight the battle of how to be successful in a market where you have other players, other competitors, positioning their offering, and you've got to figure out how to win there. But at the same time, you're simultaneously fighting a battle internally in the organization because there's always this pressure of, I need clarity on the budget for the next 12 months, or I need a detailed view on what it'll take before I can give you guidance. And so you feel this tension. And so what I learned, over the years is that there are a couple of things that you need to have in place. One is you need to make sure that you have funding enough to last you for the 1 year period that your budget cycle goes, right? Money is always the critical piece. And then the other piece is making sure that there's enough runway for the teams to make progress. And so the way, I had to kind of take existing processes and maybe adapt some of the kind of the growth board mindset was from a franchise point of view, ensure that we carved out enough funding that would support the empathy exercises, support some of the prototyping, and the evidence generation activities, but really kind of use the more growth board approach to disperse funding as something that we took on within the franchise to govern. So rather than letting it be something that went to the next level of decision making. So we kind of managed our budget, more, some might call it zero-based budgeting, where what I like to tell the teams is you earn your right to do more. And if you prove the evidence, the franchise will give you more funding to continue doing that. And so this stimulates a lot more of the team needs to to prove it out. It's not one individual. And you can try to simulate, if you will, not quite, but simulate what you see in the venture capital space, where the best teams, it's not the idea, it's the best teams that succeed. You know, it's the teams that figure out the right problem and the right solution. So that would be kind of one, one aspect of, what we did or put in place, to really help the teams advance.
What were some of the metrics you used to assess how to fund these teams? Which teams gets funding and moves on to the next stage?
I would say that we're still learning. So I would not claim that there's perfection yet. I don't think there will be, because this is always going to evolve. But the main thing I focused on early on, and I think this is something that I would encourage anybody to do, is, are you learning something new with the investment that you're putting? And not you as a leader, is the team really learning something new? And then is the team using that new knowledge to make decisions, to make choices? And so that's really, so I took that model and then focused on kind of two main things, which, if you're familiar with the business model canvas, you probably know it. But the first for me was, do you really understand, are you learning something new about the problem and the customer that problem is the highest for? Right? And you can do this through your interviews and through your experiments. You can gauge that. But what I was really looking for is the team recognizing that. And then what I complemented was kind of more my knowledge, my expertise in coaching the teams to say, okay, you found that, but are you sure that that's a strong enough signal, or in terms of the way you're asking the question? So that was one aspect. The other aspect was really kind of making sure the teams understood that the pain was high enough for somebody to pay for it. And this was probably the harder piece to figure out, because you will always hear a patient saying, yes, I will use it if product does A, B, and C. But then when you start to figure out, whether they'll pay for it, I would say 9 out of 10 times it's going to be if my insurance covers it. And this is kind of universal. We see this across the globe. If the insurance company doesn't pay for it, I may not use it. So then you need to really drill in and go and understand, where is that coming from in the healthcare system? And in today's day and age, we cannot assume that an insurance entity or a risk-bearing entity is going to add additional cost into the system if you cannot show that you're taking away cost from the system. And so this was a new learning for the team, and giving them space to really experiment that was the other piece. And so because learning was the metric for me, there were times where I had to kind of create space for the team to really accomplish that learning and secure the funding for them to accomplish that learning. Because in the eyes of kind of more the core business, it might have felt like, why are we continuing to go down this path? And so here's where I needed good support from my leadership, and I was fortunate, and I am fortunate to have that support, where we can create that space and to learn. But now I don't need to invest the same amount of time for the learning, because we've invested in that foundational knowledge. And now the question is more focusing on, how could you increase your cycle time? How do you reuse your knowledge, and only go out for new knowledge when it's an assumption that you've not tested or validated, or it's a customer segment that's different than who you previously went after. And these are probably nuances, but for me, that's important, is knowing kind of who's the customer and the problem you're focusing on, and making sure the teams don't mix them up. In our case, if you talk about a diabetic patient, we need to understand, are they a diabetic patient that's on insulin? the diabetic patient who's not yet on insulin, or are they pre-diabetic? And each category has a very different behavior. And you cannot assume because you've tested an assumption in the insulin patient, it'll work for the non-insulin patient. So paying attention to those details and also listening to how the teams are articulating their learnings and probing and asking the questions, those are, I think, in your coaching sessions, very important. Otherwise, you let teams go too far with some assumptions that were not laid on a good foundation.
So that makes total sense. I think I have a follow-up question, and this is something that when we coach organizations, we always address. And I know we sort of worked on that with you also. You mentioned initially, you were measuring progress based on customer-centric metrics when teams are trying to find a neat solution fit. And then but historically, the organization focuses on ROI metrics, right? All about scaling. So can you sort of give us an example of the conversation you had with your peers and your leaders in terms of connecting the two, or more importantly, to switch their thinking from looking at acquisition, conversion, to really these customer-centric or growth metrics?
The approach we took by showing the evidence that we gained from customers spoke louder than anything that I personally did, right? And so, I think this is where I would say that in our organization, our stage gate approach helped us. Because in our existing processes, we did separate out that for ideas that were very early, we were not asking them for financial metrics. But what I did for some of the early teams is make sure they had some understanding of willingness to pay. So rather than going into that first review board just with the need solution fit, you had some insight into kind of your solution market fit, because that then gave the team confidence to address questions that came up. And this may be just a simple test in your experiments to kind of even understand how much somebody would be willing to pay. It doesn't need to be a full-fledged, but in hindsight now, I think maybe that's part of the change management that you have to help an organization, is because you've got people who are thinking about those ROI metrics, you almost have to anticipate that they're going to ask those questions earlier than they should, and you cannot stop it. So rather than trying to change them, come prepared to answer them and say, this is why we believe we should continue investing. And so we always had this sort of forward-looking view to say, we're not saying take millions of dollars and invest. We're saying we want an additional amount of funding because we believe that there's a strong signal here. And that was a bit of the shift that we did. And I would say that that's, in the earlier stages, one of the things that I encourage the teams to go in prepared. So we didn't put them in front of the review board too early. So these are some things that you will also have to consider, if you're doing this in your organization. When's the right time to bring a team in front? If they're not ready, and as long as you believe that there's learning that's worthwhile to be gained for the organization, you continue to fund it and let them learn, but don't put them on the stage, to be shot down. But once they've passed that and they have the evidence, this is where, for me, you in a global organization, you've got to operate slightly differently than maybe a startup that's in one country. You really need to understand your priority countries, the reimbursement mechanisms, and the advantage you have in large organizations is the experts exist, or the experts may not know the answers to your question, but they know the people that can help you get the answer. And so then investing time to really understand that well, and give your teams time to understand that reimbursement pathway is the other area that we kind of invested in, I would say, over preparing the teams before they go into the board. So yeah, in summary, just over prepare your teams before they they go in, but strike a balance, right? You don't want to, I would not say spend 2 years shielding the team, but maybe break it down and say, in 9 months, push them. You want to also give your teams a bit of that reality check that the organization needs these types of metrics, and so you have to be able to defend them. Otherwise, no one would invest in the idea.
I think that whole idea of velocity is so critical. I remember doing one of the boot camps, which was, I think, 5 days, and we had maybe a 30+ year employee that was in there. And the first couple of days, he was just way out of his comfort zone and said, "This is too fast, and we can't go talk to customers this quickly and learn something." And by the end of it, he said, "I think we just did more in 1 week than I've done in the last 2 or 3 years sometimes, because we were forced to keep the pace moving." And yeah, maybe it's not perfect in week 1 or even in 90 days, but it may be a lot better and richer from an evidence and an experiment perspective than maybe the old traditional way of project management.
And those are things, Mike, that are critical for someone that's trying to introduce this in an organization to share with other leaders. Right? You need to be, and this has been true for me in all of the organizations I've been in, where I've implemented some version of the lean startup methodology. Is you need to share the impact that's happening, and if organizations can appreciate the learning impact, I think they will be more successful in adopting and accelerating. If you're not able to get to understanding and appreciating the learning impact, I think that's where you'll probably struggle and face. And this is where it's important for me to kind of be that interface to kind of between the teams and other leaders and stakeholders, to help understand, to also listen to the other side and say, okay, what are you looking for? How do we make sure we get there? How quickly can we get there? And balancing that. So there's a fine balance. In a way, for me too, I'm balancing two worlds: is kind of the execution aspect of an organization, while trying to support the search mindset and finding kind of untapped opportunities in the market.
So congratulations, Stephen. I think you've done a fantastic job with your thoughtful leadership and mentoring and balancing the search and exploration. And I believe, as you mentioned, you have a team now, or maybe a few teams, that have actually gone with the product to test and market in 18 months, which I'm sure is a rarity in healthcare. So
it's definitely been it's definitely been a key highlight for me to be able to kind of go through this and say that you could adopt these approaches in a highly regulated industry. So now the focus is much more on how do we expand. We've gone from 2 teams with a very dedicated approach to now I think we've got about 6 teams at varying stages of the development life cycle. A handful that are getting closer to launch, and still a lot more in the earlier stages. But now the focus is more on how do you train other members of the team to really kind of embrace this approach of thinking. How do you watch out as you scale to not fall back into kind of the status quo, or where you're kind of your comfort zone, if you will. So how do I need to watch? And me personally also, I'm not as close to the teams anymore. As the number of teams expand, I can't stay as close. So I've got to figure out how to probe and ask questions differently, through other leaders on my team. So it's definitely a learning process, but an exciting journey, because, at the end of the day, it's the impact you can make on patients. And I think each one of us could say that you either have someone in your family or know someone close who's impacted with diabetes. So it's a much more personal topic, specifically for me.
Well, thank you. And now I have a question for you, which is a little personal. I believe you came to this country as a college freshman, all by yourself, and had never visited your college or this country before. What was the experience like, and how has it influenced your leadership style?
Taking me back. I think so. Yes, I did sign up to join a college just by looking at a brochure and meeting the admissions counselor at the U.S. consulate in India, which was very foreign for a lot of my peers. So that was definitely quite interesting. So for me personally, I was motivated to come to and take this kind of adventure, if you will, because I had seen in a close friend of mine who had done this a couple of years ahead of me, a significant transformation in his kind of personality and development, and I wanted that. And so there was a bit of a personal drive. And so for me, I took it as an opportunity to do the best I can. It wasn't easy because the cost of education, especially in a private institution, was far more than what you would do in India. So it was definitely a sacrifice from my family. And so there were certain aspects that I knew that my parents were doing this to help me succeed. And so so I needed to also make sure that I built up a bit of resilience. And I would say my first semester, the academics was not as much of a challenge, because when you're coming from India, you're probably trained at a first level of college. So that, fortunately, that was not the challenge. It was more adapting to cultural norms, figuring out where I fit in, but then also kind of trying to balance the distance with your family, because I was the first one to venture out of the house this far. And so finding people around me to kind of help support me was critical. So my local community was extremely critical for me. And I say community because it was a mix of classmates as well as others in the town that I was in that I had to build up. And so that for me was a critical piece. The connection with my family was extremely critical, because I can remember specifically my dad, even though things were difficult figuring out how I continue to pay for college, they persevered. They gave me the encouragement to persevere. So when I look at those experiences, what I learned, the 4 years is you really don't. In my scenario, I didn't know how I would pay for 4 years of college. And so in a way, that's like what you're doing in a lean innovation. You don't know how you're getting paid for your product, but you still take your first step. So I had not necessarily thought about that parallel till you asked this question. But in a way, that's how I lived my 4 years of college. Each year was a new beginning. I had to figure it out. I had to adapt every year. In some cases, I had surety of funding for maybe 6 months or a year. But that taught me to be entrepreneurial. I found problems. I realized that the US system has jobs that you can get as a student. So I found one in the help desk of the school and found problems there that they weren't utilizing technology well enough, and proposed a solution that turned into a part-time job that paid part of my, my college. So you could say that I started to hone some of these skills. I consider them as problem-solving skills. I don't necessarily couch them as entrepreneurial because I've not necessarily ventured out as a true founder. But I would say it's honed my problem-solving skills, and that's what it taught me. And you break things down. You don't try to solve everything right at once. Focus on what's critical. But at the end of the day, what matters most is not so much the money or the grades. It's the people around you. And I think that's true personally, kind of from a family context. People around you are important in the work. It's your team. It's whether it's your leadership team or the team that you're working on. So for me, just appreciating, and I would say in today's environment, it would be remiss for me to kind of mention that it's so much important to appreciate where people are coming from and their differences. Right? And there's actually value in that. And unfortunately, we ignore it. We look for like-minded people, or we look, either the way we want them, the way we think, or the way we look. But what's actually critical is you need diversity, because it's figuring out how the diverse perspectives come together that makes you much more stronger as an individual. And for me, I experienced that because I was forced into a completely different environment. I had to find people, who were, some were like, had similar backgrounds as me, and others completely different. And I had to figure out how to make it all fit together. And that's, I think, what we as leaders need to focus on, is how do you bring diversity in thought, in experiences, as well as kind of your own traits, whether it's race, color, or gender. You got to look at diversity from all dimensions and encourage the team to find the best in all of that and put it together. And that's, for me, what I guess in some ways I've been trained in different contexts and value the most. And that's, I would not trade that experience for anything else. The one thing I tell other fellow people from India who want to come to the US is, if you are not motivated to come, don't come, because you will have a terrible experience. But if you are motivated to make the best of it, do everything you can to find a way, because you will find the opportunities and you will make the most out of it.
Thank you. I think it's amazing, isn't it, how our past experiences shape who we are, whether we realize it or not. And that was quite a story. So thank you. So one question, name the two people you would like to have dinner with, alive or not, and why?
So the two people that I would say come to mind, one is kind of a I would call him an Olympian, or as well as a missionary who has shaped a lot of kind of my beliefs. And he goes by the name of Eric Little. He worked a lot in China, but was also an Olympian in running. And one of the things that he was known for, his dedication not only to his faith but also to his profession, and balanced the two very well. And that's something that I would say that for me is important, balancing my faith as well as what I do and how I do it. I would go back to kind of maybe my roots in India, and maybe call out Mahatma Gandhi as somebody that I would love to have dinner with. I think when I look at kind of his life and what he did in South Africa, and then how he impacted change at a national level, to me right now in a global organization, that's something that I think a lot about. Is you're not always on the front lines, but what you do and how you do it and what you say has an impact on so many people. And how do you do it so that there's positive change? And I'd love to learn more and understand kind of, his journey and how he, he went through a lot more tough situations than I have experienced in my life. It would be good to understand kind of how he learned from those and kind of enabled an entire nation to follow him. So
yeah, I would love to have dinner with Mahatma Gandhi too. Coincidentally, when I asked my dad the question, he said Mahatma Gandhi also. So, what is the one unique thing you have or we will find on your desk, whether it's at home or in your office? We've had people say mushroom matcha tea. We've had Cholula sauce, so hot sauce, so anything.
Most of my stuff is what the kids make for me, and so probably the unique things that you'll find around are little things that my kids make at school. So I don't know if you can see, but you can see a little plate that my son made for Father's Day. There's several others there hanging, and then I've converted some of my monitor stands to hang the kids stuff. So getting creative on trying to find a way to create a layered approach so I can still see them and appreciate what they've done.
That is special
Is
indeed.
on my desk.
That is special indeed.
Wow. Well, thanks so much, Stephen, for taking the time. I know things are crazy for everybody right now, and you've done just a fabulous job, I think, of what this podcast is all about. And hopefully, I'm sure you're inspiring a lot of leaders and teams out there. The three big takeaways for me that I'm hoping our audience picked up on first was to really unleash the teams to learn. I picked up from you, find out who the real customer or customers are, make sure you understand their pains and their problems really well, and figure out what they're willing to pay for. Sometimes we miss that last part. The second one that I really took away was just creating the space for the folks to really show off what they've learned and setting them up for success, giving them the tools and the inspiration to get in front of the right people to get funded. And then that last piece is that real focus on evidence-based transitions. Sometimes innovation and change and new product development and design gets stuck. And I loved your quote about you earn the right to do more, and that's really all around that evidence base. And since you were so eloquent, I have 3+. So we'll give one bonus point, which was to share that impact, especially between leaders, so that they can get on fire for a new way of working, and motivating them to take that first step. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Mike and Kavita.
Yeah, and before we wrap up, I'd like to remind our listeners about our special offer. This week, you can sign up for a free 30-minute coaching session to learn to use our customer problem Zoom tool and drive impact, as Stephen mentioned, by understanding your customers' underserved needs. And don't forget to take advantage of our resources on movestheneedle.com for thriving during uncertain times. Thanks again to our guest, Stephen Ranjan. Be well and lead the shift.